Hello and welcome to another episode of All Code Sucks. In this one, well, I guess I should say, in All Code Sucks, we try and take real production code and explain how it can be improved. We're actually looking at some of my code today, and I don't know that there's a good way to improve it. So anyway, I will show you the problem, and it is very, very subtle. And one of the things that I really dislike about Python. So anyway, let's jump into it. I'll show you the code, show you the problem, and then we'll go from there. All right, so I have boiled this down from a much more complicated example to hopefully be able to point at just the very specific parts that I don't like. But here is a piece of functioning code. There's actually nothing particularly wrong with the way this is written, but there is an annoyance that I wish was better. So I've defined a function called run command here. It's going to take in the arguments that we're going to run with the subprocess module, or you could imagine it being something else. And I just wanted it to print the command that it's going to run before it runs it. In, I think, Python 3.9, there's this nice selects.join, which will properly quote the arguments such that you could copy and paste them into a shell and run it basically the same as what the subprocess module is going to, because subprocess isn't a shell. It's going to insert the arguments into the various arrays and call the underlying syscalls to actually make the process happen, not interpreting those arguments. Anyway, I digress. And so, this is a way to do this. And this is an example of how you would potentially use this function. Pass in the executable and the arguments that you want. In this case, I have one argument with a space in it. And if we run this piece of code, and then create t.py, you'll see that it prints out what the shell would have done. And just like I said before, if I copy and paste this here, we'll get the same output as what the subprocess did when it actually ran. Now this is great. And in particular, the annotation of command args here is sequence stir. This allows you to pass a tuple if you want, or a list, or I mean, there are other sequence types in Python. Dec is probably the only one I can think of right now, but again, you can make your own custom sequence, and it should all just sort of work there. And in fact, if I run this now with a list, you'll see that it succeeds and works as expected. However, oh, and it type checks. I've got MyPy here. Did pip install MyPy before this? And it type checks. Everything is great here. The thing that annoys me, and the thing that I'm not sure there's a good way to fix, is it also allows this invocation to this, passing just a string instead of some sort of sequence of strings. And you might say, well, surely the type checker should complain about that. And it doesn't. And that's because stir is actually a sequence of strings. This is because if you have a string and you iterate over a string, this is just one of the things that makes something a sequence. Iterate over a string, you're going to get individual characters. If you index into a string, it is a sequence of stir elements in the same way that if you had a list that looked the same, I guess we can just call list on it. Indexing into this list is going to look like a sequence of strings. And so unfortunately, this bit of code type checks properly. And if you run it, it's sort of going to work, but it's going to produce a bit of a nonsensical result here. Obviously, I didn't intend for my command to be echo, and of course, if I go and copy paste this into the terminal, it'll tell me E is a command not found. But it still works. And so you might say, how do we fix this? And I don't have a good answer for this today. I have a hope in the future that we may get something like type intersection or type subtraction in the type system. And so you may actually be able to represent this type as sequence stir minus stir. Obviously, this isn't a thing and it doesn't work today. But this would be a type that is a sequence, but does not allow exactly stir or stir and its subclasses. And so this might be a way that you could make this illegal here. Another option, which I don't like either, is to change this to just the concrete types that you know about. This does work. It'll forbid this, but unfortunately, it would also forbid any other custom sequence types or dec. Dec, I think, works in this function. I haven't tried it, but This has some downsides in that we have to enumerate all of the particular sequence types we care about, and we're potentially leaving out others that would work just fine for this function, but doesn't do what we want. And so this isn't a great solution. And so I think the answer to this is I'm just going to keep using sequence stir and be very careful about looking out for cases where something like this happens. And actually, the reason that I noticed this code at all in the first place was actually due to a subtle bug where somebody had intended to pass a tuple into a particular function call here, but instead they ended up with just a parenthesized string. I think I have several other videos about this, and that like the syntax for a tuple actually isn't the parentheses, it's the comma that makes it important, except for empty tuple. And so this looked like it was working, and the type checker passed, and the tests passed, but it was actually doing something sort of nonsensical because of a similar bug to this. It actually intended was. But anyway, sequence stir is a tiny little landmine, and it's kind of a weird wart of Python in that like iterating a string gives you more strings. In fact, iterating those strings that you get from iterating a string also gives you strings. It's just strings all the way down, partially because Python doesn't really have a character type. And it does have a character type, Anthony. If you have bytes, those give you integers inside. Those are kind of character. Anyway, Python stirs don't really have a relevant character type. And so, unfortunately, you end up with this sort of wart here. Hopefully you found this useful. If you have additional things you would like, well, actually, no, that's the other series. Anyway, leave a comment below what you think about this, how we could possibly fix this, and I'll see you in the next one.